So when I look at this question, the first thing that stands out to me is that I have a square power. And because I have a square power, it's not a linear equation. It is, of course, a quadratic equation. And with the quadratic equation, we have all these different methods. We have our factoring methods, quadratic formula method, we have the completing the square method, and the square root property. But really at the heart of it, like when you look at this, you have to isolate x and you have a square. And what undoes a square? What undoes a square, of course, is the square root. Now, we can easily undo the square power by taking the square root of both sides. But when we do that, important to remember is that a quadratic equation, because this power is 2, we are supposed to have 2 answers. So it's not just supposed to be x is equal to. A 2 power means that we're supposed to have 2 answers. They might be repeated, they might be complex, but there should be 2 numbers at the end of the day. And when I take the square root of both sides, I just get square root of negative 40. And that right there should really stand out to you because you're thinking quadratic 2 answers, but you're only getting 1 answer. And so that's the special thing that we remember about taking the square root of both sides is that when we take the square root of both sides, it's not just take the square root, it's add a plus or minus to the number side. And that comes from quadratic should have 2 answers. So we need a plus answer and we need a minus answer. Now, from there we simplify. So the negative, because remember we talked about how I is equal to the square root of negative 1, that negative is going to come out in front, and when it does, it becomes an I. Now, what you are reducing here is you are reducing the square root of negative 40. So when you bring out the I, it's still going to be before or after the plus or minus sign. Because again, this square root of negative 40 is somehow going to become a simplified version, which will still have the I there. Okay, and the I is after the plus or minus sign. Now, we've got to reduce the square root of 40. So to do that, we are going to draw a factor tree. And so you sit there and you draw your little factor tree. You have 8 and 5. 8 is going to be 4 and 2. And then 2, 2. This 2 comes down and this 5 comes down. Now, with a square root, the understood index, as we talked about, is 2. So what we do is we group these guys in groups of 2's. So we have 2 2's here. So when we bring that out in front of the square root, that is going to be 1 copy of 2. So we will have a 2 that is brought out in front of the square root. And then if you look at what's left over, you have 2 and 5. And there's no groups and groups of 2's there. So we have to keep that. The ungrouped numbers will stay inside of the radical just as they are. So they'll be inside the radical as is. You're not going to do any changes to that. And so you'll have inside the radical 2 times 5, which gives us 10. Now, you can rewrite this. The key thing, though, to remember is that all of this I2 square root of 10 is going to stay after the plus or minus, just like the square root of 40 was after the plus or minus. So a lot of times what we do is we write it as plus or minus 2I square root of 10. So you have the number, the imaginary, and then the radical. And that's a good kind of format to think about, is that it will be the number, the imaginary, and then the square root. So coefficient, the x, quote unquote, and then the square root sign.